South Africa has made an urgent appeal to the International Court of Justice regarding Israel's relentless military action in Gaza. Last month, the ICJ ruled that Israel should prevent acts of genocide and submit provisional measures being implemented to abide by the order within a month of that ruling. Let's get you some analysis on the unfolding situation in Gaza, particularly on Rafah. Joining us is Dr. Mia Swart, who is an international law and human rights expert. She's also a visiting professor at Wits University. Dr. Swart, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. And I want to go back to that original order by the ICJ, right, which was that Israel stop the killing and harming of people in Gaza. Do you reckon what's unfolding now in Rafah is partly because the court did stop short in its original decision to ask for a ceasefire, to order a ceasefire?
Good afternoon. Yes, that's a good question. In my view, it's not the result of the court's failure to order a ceasefire. In my view, Israel would have violated that order as well. I do think it's unfortunate that the court didn't take that step, but I think there can be little doubt that Israel was determined to continue with its military action, with its killing of civilians, as we've seen all the way from the 26th of January until today.
So this urgent request filed by South Africa to the World Court on the 12th, just this past Monday, how effective is it really, Dr. Swart, on the actions that Israel will continue to take?
Well, it's difficult not to be pessimistic in light of Netanyahu's clear violation of the provisional orders so far. It seems unlikely that he will comply with any additional measures. I do think it's very important that South Africa take the step and that South Africa stays with the case, if you will, that it continues to exert pressure on Israel and that it, doesn't sort of, now take a step backwards now that it comes to the enforcement stage, because this is all about enforcement. This provisional measures phase is incredibly important in this case because it's about saving lives.
Yeah, and I mean, these airstrikes, these missile attacks that have devastated the Gaza Strip for many, many weeks now, the death toll is well above 28,000, 68,000 more people wounded, and the bulk of that is women and children. And despite that, Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu continuing to say that, quote, total victory was in sight, and that this latest bombardment of the Rafah border was part of the ultimate destroying of Hamas.
That's right. His rhetoric is very, very belligerent and very concerning, and we know that it's not just about Hamas at this stage because too many civilians are dying. And, I think that what we've seen so far this week has just been the beginning of an obliteration of Rafah under the sort of excuse of self-defense, which no doubt Israel will argue in its response to our request for additional measures.
So Rafah, and particularly the south of Gaza, it was meant to be a safe zone, right? I mean, humanitarian organizations, when this announcement was made of this upcoming bombardment of Rafah, were really, as you say, pleas for that not to happen. What's it going to take for there to be a different turn of events here? I mean, it's fair to say there's been some international condemnation, but perhaps not from where it needs to come. The U.S., for example.
Right. So we know the Red Cross has said that, people in Rafah have nowhere to go, that, it is simply absurd for Israel to expect them to move, because where would they move to? Would they move north, where they've already been, in a sense, chased away from? I think that there probably isn't enough time to allow for the U.S. to change course entirely. We know that the U.S. has supported Israel for so many decades that the urgency of this matter will not allow, time to sort of let the U.S. come to its senses, if you will. In my view, the solution, or a much sort of quicker, effective solution, would be for countries such as Qatar, Egypt, and hopefully Saudi Arabia, to push for a ceasefire, to negotiate, because we saw that the only interruption in the hostilities so far was as a result of negotiations taking place in Qatar. So I don't think that the legal route is going to actively stop the hostilities. This doesn't mean that the legal route isn't important, but in terms of actual results, we need to see Israel, agreeing to the conditions of a ceasefire.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Swart. It's something that South Africa has been pushing. I mean, we remember our presentation at the ICJ some weeks ago, applause from all parts of the world just about the level of skill that our top legal minds showed in their presentations to the ICJ. What I want to ask you is, do you think that South Africa's pursuing of this issue may have some impact on us here at home and perhaps even on those very lawyers who made that presentation at the ICJ?
Well, I suspect your question flows from the fact that Naledi Pandor mentioned that she was being threatened by Israeli intelligence, possibly. If that's your line of inquiry, I think this is definitely not impossible. But I don't think this is highly feasible. I think that what is more likely is that South Africa might face challenges down the road. If Donald Trump, for example, gets re-elected, he might take a very dim view of South Africa's strong support for Palestine. This is at this point still uncertain, but it's impossible to predict, but likely in terms of the Republican view on Israel, and also the fact that, Americans remain staunchly supportive of providing Israel with generous aid. We've seen a bill being passed by the Senate in the U.S. just this week, to the tune of providing Israel with about $14 billion of, additional military aid. So, from this point of view, I'm not sure that the ICJ case is really going to stop the way U.S. senators and, U.S. members of Congress are going to vote on these kinds of issues.
Yeah, it's very interesting. President Cyril Ramaphosa, after an NEC meeting, in his closing address at an NEC meeting at the end of last month, he made the comment that South Africa's stance on Gaza could attract some form of retaliation. He called it covert election interference by Israel or its Western backers. Is that not, do you reckon, something that we should be concerned about? And I suppose the question then also becomes, do we have the intelligence that would be able to detect such a threat?
Well, I think, again, that this would become clearer around the time of the U.S. elections. It's not so easy to predict right now, and it's not so easy to predict the format that we take. But I think it's also important that President Ramaphosa, takes a look at whether, his government is really consistent. Because as much as I'm an absolutely fervent supporter of Gaza at this point and the Palestinian civilians who are facing impossible conditions of life, I also think that, our foreign policy is not always human rights friendly, and that, the government shouldn't sort of shift all attention away from those kinds of issues. It's not an unqualified hero when it comes to foreign policy issues. Yeah, certainly. Dr. Mia Swart, let me thank you for your time. An international law and human rights expert, also a visiting professor at Wits University. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon.